"Where are the humans?" the alien commander roared, causing many of his troops to flinch. The Saurian alien stood tall and proud, but filled with rage at having been denied a good battle. After all, when the Empire had attacked the humans, they'd been met with such fierce resistance that one could almost mistake the humans for being reptilian, and not pathetic mammals. They had fought tooth and nail over systems that seemed to hold no value, at least to the Empire, that is. Clearly they held great value to the humans, and had bled quite profusely in their defense. A commander approached the War Master of this particular branch of the war effort, and presented him with a tablet. "Spy footage says that the human colonists fled to this wooded area. All attempts at bombing the forest have met with failure. They seem to have some sort of shield we can't detect in place, and the trees are so densely packed that our armor will be useless," the commander said, while the War Master looked it over, frowning, and even growling in anger. "Cowards, the lot of them! Prepare the troops then. We'll march in there and hunt them down the old-fashioned way. In the meantime, send the armor units to secure and loot the cities. We'll take their positions as our trophies." The commander bowed, and turned to relay the War Master's orders. The alien's reptilian gaze turned towards the sprawling forest, a forest that covered almost 2/4 of this backwater planet. He growled softly, getting the feeling that he was being watched by something within that forest. 4 hours later, 2 full battalions were marching into the forest. Unlike many forests where the edges were composed of the youngest trees, it all seemed to be nothing but old growth. The air stank of ancient history, of experiences carried on the wind that had existed long before the first of their species had ever hatched from their homeworld. The forest felt wrong. The sheer thickness of the canopy resulted in a perpetual gloom, broken up now and then by the odd beam of sunlight managing to break through, and the soldiers marched on. They infrequently found signs of the humans' passage through the forest, torn fabric caught on thorns and branches, perhaps a few drops of blood here and there, neatly piled refuge that had clearly been marked for later retrieval. They even came across the remains of a camp, the fire pit still producing minimal warmth, a sign that the humans had recently vacated, earlier that day. But the deeper they went, the darker things became, both literally and figuratively. What animals they encountered seemed to avoid going any deeper, as though something in the heart of the forest triggered their flight responses almost exclusively. Soon, squads started to report finding strange totems hanging from the branches or affixed to crude stakes. The skulls of animals and claws, teeth, bones lined entire sections, laid out in ritualistic fashion. Many began to feel the scales on the backs of their necks begin to tingle, the feeling of unfriendly eyes upon them. But still they had not found a single human. Many were ordered to backtrack, in an attempt to see if they'd somehow missed the humans, but that seemed unlikely. They sent the weakest willed soldiers back, as their cowardice was starting to make itself blatantly obvious. A cry rose from a squad on the right flank, the sound of laser fire echoing through the trees, and when the report came in, the soldiers stated they'd seen something move, something pale, and that it looked like a human. From the left flank, the same incident occurred. Something pale and distinctly human had flitted between the trees at impossible speeds for a human. The War Master pushed them onwards. They'd had their first real sighting, and it was time to close in for the kill. Things were going fine till a scream rose from the rear, and those closest turned to watch as one of their comrades was dragged by the ankle into the undergrowth, the screams turning choked and wet. A few went to see if they could find anything of their now missing comrade, but all they found was the blood trailing into a hole in the ground. More and more of them were picked off, one by one, then faster and faster as they delved deeper. Some were pulled into the air, their blood raining down upon those below. Others yanked fiercely off their feet and sent flying, only to be found later impaled on the thick branches. Some were dragged to the bases of trees, the roots shifting to crush and suffocate them. Their numbers dwindled rapidly, till it was just the War Master and his honor guard. A dense mist settled over the forest floor, and no more lives were lost as he stepped into something close to a clearing. And here he found a most peculiar sight indeed. A woman. Human, clearly. She was dressed rather strangely, and based on his studies of human history, for one could learn much about their enemies if they studied their past, she looked like she'd walked straight out of the Victorian era. The dark colours of her garb, and the fact they looked rather fashionable, suggested she was someone wealthy and important. Furthermore, she was clearly not all that bothered by his presence, as she sat at a fine table with a teacup in her hand, and an array of treats set out before her. Her carmine-tinted lips twisted into a polite smile, a smile reflected in her silver eyes. A breeze caught the feather in her hat, causing it to shift slightly. "Welcome, welcome. Please do sit. I hope the journey wasn't too bothersome," she said, her voice refined and noble. The veiled jab at his considerable losses was not lost on him. But he couldn't simply cut her down. She had yet to actually attack him, and it would be a great dishonor to do so without provocation. I assure you the seat is quite sturdy, though I'm afraid I didn't have one in an appropriate size. I do hope you can forgive such a blunder. He glanced at the seat in question. It was a delicate-looking thing, and he was certain it had a break under his bulk. But he sat slowly, and there wasn't even the sound of it complaining under his weight. Finally, he returned his attention to this woman, his eyes narrowing. Where are the rest of the humans? They are subjects of the Empire, must be put in line, he growled, and the woman made a motion of her shoulder with a gloved hand. Oh, don't worry about them. They're deeper in the forest, far, far away from you. Humans, such silly beings, aren't they? She giggled, her eyes sparkling softly. Would you like some tea, or perhaps a slice of pie? I assure you it's all quite tasty. She motioned towards the spread between them, and he did have to admit that it all smelled rather nice. At least these humans knew how to cook. They make excellent servants once broken in. I am not hungry. Your loss. Never let a pie go to waste, that's what they say. But oh well. Now, to business. I assume you're about to demand the unconditional surrender of these colonists, are you not? He nodded. And I assume that if they do not comply, then you'll put them down for something silly like insurrection, or whatever? He nodded again, and she sighed, shaking her head. Well, now that simply won't do. You see, I'm here to negotiate your immediate departure from this planet, and every other planet in this system as well. Why, I might as well get it over with and work on the full surrender of your empire, so you can get properly kicked out of human space. The War Master bristled, starting to rise and raise his voice to make his displeasure heard, but something flashed in her eyes that wasn't right. And her voice changed considerably as well, tinged with something distinctly inhuman. Sit down and be silent. And he did, sitting down hard enough to make the chair groan. The firm, authoritative look on her face melted instantly, returning to pleasant and polite. There, that's better. I want you to listen to me rather carefully, War Master Frumer, because I do not intend on repeating myself. You are meddling with a species that has made some rather interesting friends ever since they lived in caves, and could barely think in a coherent and intelligent manner. They may seem like easy prey to most, but I assure you they are not. And if they cannot handle an enemy, they have a habit of turning to those that can. Like me, for example. It's been a long time since I've been asked for help. Humans are quick to adapt to many situations, but sometimes they just need a little help. She smiled, and he felt something twisting in his gut as he heard strange sounds from around him, but he found he couldn't turn his attention away from the woman. Now, you have two options before you, friend. The first is to continue upon the path you put yourself on, and that will result in the deaths of yourself and everyone under your command. Or you can be sensible and surrender, suffer the shame of defeat, but continue living without incurring further losses. I assure you that you would not be harmed as you fled this world, and the other worlds within this system, and I do always keep my word. Now, I'll let you think it over. Perhaps you really should have some of that pie, She pushed a slice of pie towards him, and he could feel hunger blossoming in his gut. Carefully he took it, cut off a bite and started to eat, mulling over his options. To continue against this unknown foe would mean potential defeat, but to surrender would have him executed the moment he made it home. The choice was obvious to him as he took a third bite of pie, then set the slice down and lifted his head, fixing a stern gaze upon the woman. I will not surrender this system. I will fight to the last man if I must, but before I kill you I would know your name. Speak it, human, he said, having not exactly caught on just yet. The woman sighed, closing her eyes for a moment before opening them with a smile. My name is... but you may just call me Celeste. Now, shall we dispense with the pleasantries? She said, and all around him the world changed. It was like a curtain over his mind had been pulled away, and the world was revealed as it truly was. Behind the Celeste woman stood humans, men and women, who looked like something out of their fantasies. They wore scraps of fur and bone. Some were old and some were young, but they all had an air of something dark about them. Worse still, what was behind him, for he could turn his head to see now, and he found his Onagar standing and swaying, their bodies twisted by vine and plant growth. From several of their mouths protruded flowers that had not ever once existed in this universe, but had taken root within the bodies of his men. And there was more than just his honor guard standing there. The rest of the battalion was with them, mangled and infested with beautiful flowers. Fear coursed through his veins as his gaze turned back to Celeste, as she raised a gloved hand, a flower of flesh and veins growing from the leather of her glove, cutting around her fingers. "I did warn you, but pride is such a damning thing. Dears, be so kind as to restrain him." And so the Coven, for that was what they were, a collection of people who still practiced the odd ways, moved to hold him down upon a chair that had seemed normal at first. But now that he could see it, not only was the chair and the table anything but normal, but crafted from the bones of his own soldiers. Even the food, which had looked so succulent before, was made from his soldiers. He could see a hint of green scales protruding from the slice of pie he'd been eating. He felt sick, but mostly he felt afraid. Celeste stood, one hand hurling the table away into the forest, and then approaching him. She smiled, a smile that should have been impossible as it stretched wider and wider, baring innumerable teeth as her flesh bubbled and stretched, unveiling her true form. "Don't struggle, my dear. It'll only hurt worse if you do," she said, her voice dissonant and inhuman, as she placed the flower against his mouth. His screams echoed through the forest for hours. Days later, the ships of the Empire that had been in the Veridanti system were spotted entering another system, covered in strange floral growths. The gardens of Mibir spread and sought fertile ground in which they could root, and deep within the forest, the Coven stood watch, ensuring that humanity would always be protected. In the centuries that followed, none dared attack the humans again, for many of the humans still followed the old ways of magic, and had some very old friends indeed. Friends who enjoyed a good meal.